All right, Alexander, we have a lot of news on the Trump-Russia collusion, the Mueller special counsel, Russiagate. You just called it 5 minutes ago before we got on this video, Muellergate. It appears to be wrapping up, but there's a lot of potential indictments, I guess, against characters that I never thought would even be brought into this, like Roger Stone or Jerome Corsi. Me personally, I was going through the chronicle of the timelines that tweets were sent and who was speaking with Assange and how they dragged Assange into this as well. I would like you to address that as well. And who was looking for what from Assange. Roger Stone sent tweets. Corsi sent tweets. Corsi was on Hannity yesterday, as was Roger Stone, and they gave their side of the events. It's quite confusing, and there's a lot going on. So I would like Alexander to take your time and kind of give us a little bit of your insight and a little bit of your light as to what is happening here, so that we understand, all the intricacies of this latest news on the Mueller investigation.
Right. I think the first thing to say, Alex, is that when you actually unpack it, what looks confusing turns out to be a lot less confusing than it actually seems. It's because we are probably at a very late stage of the Mueller investigation. There is this burst of activity to try and get something together to basically put in his report, which will make it seem as if this whole exercise has been worthwhile. Now, if we go back to where Mueller started, he was looking for collusion between Donald Trump's campaign and the Russians. And he was also, at some point, decided to look into the question of whether there was obstruction on the part of Donald Trump and trying to prevent the investigation of the collusion allegations going forward, and whether his sacking of James Comey had some form of obstruction about it. Well, we now I think can say quite conclusively that the obstruction business has fallen apart. I don't think anybody looking at all the facts concludes that there was any obstruction going on. Now, the great problem Mueller has had is that he cannot prove collusion between Donald Trump and the Russians. There's been very few contacts between Donald Trump and the Russians, and Donald Trump's campaign and the Russians, and all those contacts have turned out to amount to far less than they seem. So we had Jeff Sessions meeting with the Russian ambassador a few times. Nothing came of that. We had Michael Flynn talking to the Russian ambassador over the phone. There was no evidence of collusion in that. There was George Papadopoulos being incited, as it turns out, by various people in the deep state, like Stephen Halpern and Joseph Mifsud, to have contacts with the Russians. That never amounted to anything. There was no collusion there, nothing involving the DNC leak, nothing of that kind. Then, of course, we've now just had the pressure on Michael Cohen. No doubt we will see and hear more about him, and we'll discuss this further in this program. But there's been attempts now to use Michael Cohen to prove collusion with the Russians. The only thing he's been able to come up with, as far as I can see, is that the Trump organization was persisting with a real estate deal in Moscow up to June 2016 instead of January 2016. I don't see where that takes us. And of course, there was Donald Trump Jr.'s famous meeting with Galina Veselnitskaya in Trump Tower. I think that was in May 2016. And again, it turns out that didn't amount to anything either. So Mueller has drawn a blank on all of these things. So what he's now trying to do is not prove collusion between the Trump organization, the Trump campaign, and the Russians. He's now trying to go a step further, and he's trying and insinuate that collusion by highlighting contacts or alleged contacts between various individuals who were peripherally involved in the Trump campaign and WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks being the organization that actually published the DNC and Podesta emails. Now, I think before we actually unpack all of that, it is very important to say that it is not a crime to contact WikiLeaks. I mean, the fact that people like Roger Stone and Jeremy Corsi and a man called Tim Mallock, who's actually British, may or may not have contacted WikiLeaks is not a crime, and it does not prove collusion between the Trump campaign and Russia. Moreover, these alleged contacts, and I want to stress and emphasize at this moment the word alleged, because we have to unpack this. These alleged contacts only seem to have happened after WikiLeaks began to publish the DNC emails. Now, there was an attempt by The Guardian a few days ago to try to claim that Paul Manafort had contacts with Julian Assange way back before the DNC emails were published. But that story is rapidly falling apart, and there's even attempts now to pretend it's all another Russian decision exercise. There's a weird article in Politico which claims that, so we can, I think, disregard that. Now, the great problem is that when you actually look at what Jeremy Corsi, Roger Stone, and Tim Mallock were doing or not doing with WikiLeaks, it doesn't actually seem as if they had any role in leaking these DNC emails whatsoever. And I think we can go into this in more detail, but it seems to me that what has happened is that Jeremy Corsi guessed that WikiLeaks had Podesta's emails, which they were going to publish. And I want to explain, I will explain in a moment after we've, later in this program, why it is not surprising that he was able to guess that the WikiLeaks had those emails of Podesta and was going to publish them. And they're trying, that's to say, Mueller is trying to use this fact that Corsi made that guess, which was a correct guess, to prove some kind of connection between Corsi and WikiLeaks. The problem is, it doesn't seem as if Corsi actually had any contact with WikiLeaks. He insists he didn't. It doesn't seem that Roger Stone at that time had any contact with WikiLeaks. He was trying to get Corsi to contact WikiLeaks on his behalf and clearly didn't know at that time what sort of emails WikiLeaks had. And as for this Tim Mallock character that we've been hearing so much about, it seems that he didn't do very much with WikiLeaks either. So we have something that actually, when you look at it carefully, amounts to nothing, but which is at the moment causing a noise. Now, I'm going to say one last thing before I let you interject and ask more questions, which is that the way Mueller is trying to pressure all these people into saying things is something that makes me extremely uneasy indeed, and which I wonder whether, when the courts have an opportunity to look at this, they're going to be happy. I mean, it seems to me that Mueller's entire tactic now is to trick people into perjury traps, pile on the pressure upon them, and try to get them to admit to things, some of which these people insist they never did.
All right, so there's a lot to unpack here, Alexander, and all of this hinges on the assumption that WikiLeaks is somehow connected to the Russian state, to Russia. If that's the case, then all of this contact with WikiLeaks, okay, I can see the road that Mueller's going down, but it all hinges on this assumption that WikiLeaks is connected to Russia.
That's right. And can I stress, Mueller has not been able to prove that. If you go back to that famous indictment that he made against those 12 Russians, what he showed is that the entire contact between WikiLeaks that he has identified was not with the Russian intelligence officers that he claimed to have identified, but with an entity called Guccifer Now, he has not been able to prove that that WikiLeaks knew that Guccifer was a front for Russian intelligence. But what is even more striking is that if you read his indictment very carefully, he has not even been able to prove that WikiLeaks got the emails, that the allegedly hacked emails, which he published from Guccifer. He's only able to imply it. He can't prove it. So, and I would add one further point about that, which is, of course, that WikiLeaks may or may not have had connections with Russia. There is no evidence that Roger Stone or Jeremy Corsi ever believed that WikiLeaks had any contacts with Russia or was in any way involved with Russian intelligence.
Yeah, there's a lot of claims, very strong claims, that the emails, all the files that were given to WikiLeaks, the documents, were in fact downloaded onto a thumb drive. There's actually technical evidence that shows that it was not via the internet, but it was actually via a thumb drive that these documents were obtained by WikiLeaks. But either way, WikiLeaks has not stated, and Assange has not gone on record at all to state where he got this this document dump. So Mueller's at a dead end here.
He is at a dead end. And may I point out that when you say that there is a lot of speculation that it was in fact a leak and that a thumb drive was used, the person who is saying this is William Binney, who is the former technical director of the NSA, perhaps the most best-informed forensic expert in the world on this issue. So this is a theory that should absolutely not be discounted. And of course, Assange and Craig Murray, who both claim they know the truth, both insist that it was a leak and not a hack. Now, I'm not speculating further. All I am saying is that is what all these people say. What Binney says, what Assange says, what Craig Murray says. And Mueller has not been able to prove the contrary. Even his indictments show this.
All right, let's get a bit more into detail on Corsi and Stone. Corsi has gone specifically on Fox. He was on Tucker, and as I said before in the beginning of the video, he was on Hannity last night, as was Stone. And the questions that were given to Corsi, I want you to take us through it a little bit of his answers, because Hannity pressed him a little. He said, how did you know when you sent this tweet on this information that there would be a document released by WikiLeaks in October? How did you come to that conclusion? Did you guess? Was it speculation, or was it something else? And then Corsi walked us through his train of logic to get to that conclusion that he made, that there would indeed be some sort of document leaked by WikiLeaks in October. Take us through the way Corsi went about it.
I mean, if I may say, one of the problems with Corsi is that he makes his own train of thought, which is actually very simple, sound rather complicated, because he uses rather, shall we say, technical language to describe it. He talks about an analysis, when in fact really what he's doing is guessing. Now, Corsi knew quite a lot about the kind of computer system that the DNC had. He also knew, obviously, that John Podesta was the chairman of Hillary Clinton's campaign. I mean, the whole world knew that fact. He went through the DNC emails that WikiLeaks had published up to that point, and he noticed that there were none involving John Podesta. And he put two and two together, and he guessed, quite rightly, that there would have had to be emails from Podesta going through those DNC computers. And those would almost certainly have been emails that WikiLeaks had obtained. And the fact that WikiLeaks had not yet published them meant that in a few weeks or shortly after, they would be publishing those Podesta emails also. Now, that is a perfectly sound chain of deduction. Ultimately, it was a guess, but it was an informed guess. It was an intelligent guess. It's the kind of guess people make. And he was right.
All right.
There isn't any reason to look beyond it.
Right. So he guessed it right. He even guessed, I guess he thought it's going to be an October surprise. These things are usually released in October. So he got the date. But take us through, because one of the main arguments...
He got the date roughly right. He didn't get it exactly right. He said it was 2nd of October. Julian Assange seems to be thinking it might be the 3rd of October. They were actually released on the 7th of October. And, of course, you're absolutely right. October surprise is what it was. Again, that's not really very tough deduction. Many people could make that. Carry on.
The argument that a lot of the Russiagate believers make is that why did WikiLeaks release this 1 hour or 2 hours after the NBC tape where Russia was groping, where Trump was groping a reporter? I even forgot what the hell it was. Where Trump was groping. Why was this timed 1 or 2 hours after that? Can you also deduce? Can you make an assumption, Alexander, that WikiLeaks either had it? It was either coincidence that NBC news story broke and WikiLeaks had already planned to release the documents at this certain time, and the coincidence was on NBC's side? Or can you make the guess that WikiLeaks said, you know what, Hillary, the Clinton campaign, and Podesta, specifically Podesta, just released this dirt on Trump. You know what? We're going to release this dirt on Podesta now in order to keep things balanced. Which one? How do you see that argument unfolding? Right.
First of all, I don't know what the thinking was, but I'm going to make a guess. I think that they were intending to release the emails anyway, but that you're probably right that by this point, Julian Assange especially had developed quite a strong feelings about Hillary Clinton. And when he saw what was being done to Trump, he said, this is the moment for me to hit back by getting John Podesta in trouble. So on balance, I suspect it wasn't a coincidence. I mean, it was part of the cut and thrust, if you like, of the election with which various actors were involved. I don't know that for a fact. Perhaps it was chance. Who knows? But at the end of the day, if we're looking at this from the general perspective of the collusion narrative between Donald Trump and the Russians, why does it matter?
Right.
I mean, what Assange's motives might have been in choosing the date to release these emails is really, it seems to me, a red herring, and we shouldn't get distracted by these kind of speculations away from the real issue, which is, has there been proof of collusion? And the answer is no.
Right, and let's not forget that Assange had in his hands emails where Hillary Clinton openly called for his assassination. So I'm sure that he had some pretty strong feelings against Hillary Clinton. So, he really stuck it to her there. And that's perfectly understandable if you're asking me, why he released those at the time that he did.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And you're making a very important point, because, of course, people talk about Donald Trump's motives in this matter. People talk about Russia's motives in this matter. They're not looking at the person who actually released the emails, who is not Donald Trump. And it was not Russia. It was Julian Assange. And he had very strong motives to not like Hillary Clinton and to not want to see her president of the United States.
Absolutely. There is a human story to this. And
absolutely.
Going back now to try to prove collusion and what Mueller's doing now, we have the news about Cohen. Get into this a little bit before we finish out this segment, because from what I understand, this is about Cohen trying to get a hotel deal in Moscow. How the hell does this connect to collusion during an election?
Well, it doesn't. I mean, you put your finger on it. If Cohen had been able to come up with something more, sinister, something, Donald Trump was on the phone to Vladimir Putin during the election, and they were talking about all kinds of things, all sorts of things going on of that nature, that would have been a big story. I don't see again that this is a big story of any sort at all, even assuming, of course, that it is true. And, Cohen is a serial liar, as it turns out. He's a fraudster. He's a crook. He's a solicitor who's turned on his client, a lawyer rather, sorry, who's turned on his client in a big, big way. Do we necessarily believe him? All the more, given that he's now admitting he's lying. Well, first of all, I don't know that we do believe him, but even assuming this is true, what, again, does it prove? Does it prove collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians to leak the DNC and Podesta emails? No, it doesn't. So let's not get distracted by it.
Why would, and even if it is true, and I'll also make another assumption, I'm sure Cohen may have had a kickback or was thinking maybe I'll get a kickback if I close this hotel deal. Maybe I'll get, pay some money out of this to let me try to push this along. I'm sure he wasn't doing this out of the goodness of his own heart. Maybe he was billing hours on this to the Trump organization. So I'm sure he was making money by trying to get a hotel, which is what Trump does. That was his business in Moscow. But why would it matter what Cohen was doing when on the flip side, you had Bill Clinton getting paid for speeches in Russia and Hillary Clinton, who was Secretary of State, in the whole Uranium One deal, getting kickbacks to the Clinton Foundation. The hypocrisy is pretty obvious here.
It's astonishing. And can I just make a point before we continue, which is, of course, that it is not a crime to want to open a hotel in Moscow. I mean, it's crazy to think that this is a big deal of any kind. The Uranium One business, for me, is a much more serious matter. Now, you can make defenses for the conduct of the Obama administration and Hillary Clinton and all those people involved. But if you want to talk about the scale of things in terms of deals and the potential to do harm, well, Uranium One is in a completely different league. I mean, Donald Trump wanted to open a hotel in Moscow, and he didn't succeed. And where's the story again? I mean, where's the beef? I don't see it.
Yeah, you would think if Putin was training Trump from a young age and bringing him up to be president, the least he could do was give him a hotel in Moscow. But now
you would have muted me, Alex.
Yeah.
Alex, you would have muted me.
But before I let you go, Alexander, I want to ask you one more thing, which I have written down here, and that's G20 and the timing of all this activity. Yeah. What do you make of it? Because we've seen this before. They always go after Trump right before he's about to meet with Putin. Always. And Mueller did it last time, I think, in Helsinki. Again, he did it with indictments, and he's doing it again now.
Indeed, and that is exactly right, and we see this pattern recurring, and I don't think there's any coincidence about it. I mean, we've had already pressure on Trump not to speak to Putin over the the Kerch Straits incident between the Russian and Ukrainian ships, and now, of course, we see this huge flurry of frantic activity involving Cohen, involving Corsi, involving Stone, involving Malak, none of which actually leads anywhere, but clearly all intended, at least in part, to make any meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Buenos Aires at the G20 more difficult. And in a sense, that tells you more than anything else what the real agenda behind this investigation is. I mean, it's got multiple agendas, but one of them certainly is to make any rapprochement between the US and Russia more difficult.
Because Mueller, who was instrumental in the Iraq War WMD lies, let's not forget that he lied openly about Iraq WMDs. To me, Mueller, he's a fixer in a way. He's a guy that comes in and cleans up a mess, or he fixes stuff for the deep state. Real quickly, what's your impression of Mueller now that this thing is coming to an end?
I'm going to admit a mistake, which of course not everybody does, I've noticed, but I mean, I certainly do. I'm going to make a mistake. I'm going to admit a mistake here. When Mueller was appointed special counsel, I said to myself, this is a man who's got a good reputation. He's got lots of experience. He's the person who's come in to try and prove that this story is a hoax, because I couldn't bring myself to believe that a person who'd been director of the FBI and who'd worked in the DOJ for so long could be somebody who was there to promote the hoax. I was totally wrong about that. It seems to me that Mueller is behaving in exactly the way you've described. He clearly sees his interests as protecting the FBI, the DOJ, and the rest of the deep state in this conspiracy that they engaged with against Donald Trump during the 2016 election to prevent him becoming president and to prevent him improving relations with Russia. Now, we've discussed that real conspiracy many, many times. We're not going to go over it now, but I mean, people can look at our previous videos where we've discussed the surveillance of Carter Page, the incitement of George Papadopoulos, the wiretapping, the illegal monitoring that was all of which was going on. Mueller is there to protect the people who were involved in all of that. One of them, James Comey, is, of course, a personal friend. And I'm going to add something else, which is a point I made at the start of this program, which is look at how Mueller is doing it. He's going around landing people in perjury traps. He's threatening them with long spells in prison. He's done this with Paul Manafort, not just with a perjury trap in his case, by dredging up financial affairs that Manafort was involved with before, some of which were indisputably criminal and corrupt. And he uses that to not just extract confessions from these people, but to get them to implicate others. Now, to my mind, that is using pressure, moral pressure, to force people into saying things they would not wish to say, and which Jeremy Corsi, at least, is now saying would have been untrue. And in Paul Manafort's case, Paul Manafort is saying he was trying to force me to say things which were untrue. And George Papadopoulos essentially has said the same thing. Now, that is deeply unethical and wrong behavior. I have to say, I question the legal value of any kind of so-called testimony or evidence that was obtained in that way. And that goes directly to the heart of some of the things that Michael Cohen is saying. So Mueller is behaving, in my opinion, wholly inappropriately. And it astonishes me, amazes me, that people in the US are not saying it.
Yeah, he's ruined a lot of lives. I mean, a lot of lives.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, Manafort is going to spend a long time in prison. Well, perhaps he deserves. Flynn has been totally destroyed. An honorable general,
a veteran, a war hero.
A veteran, a war hero, a highly decorated military officer. He was a hysteria blown up around some telephone conversations with the Russian ambassador, which everybody accepts. He did nothing wrong. He did absolutely nothing wrong by holding those conversations. He was tricked into a perjury trap. He's got criminal conviction, and his reputation has been trashed. Terrible. George Papadopoulos is now serving a prison sentence. Again, what did he do? He spoke to some Russian people, not even proper officials, people involved in the Valdai Club, an NGO. He was maneuvered into a perjury trap, almost certainly because he got some dates mixed up. I mean, it doesn't seem to me anything more than that. He's landed with a criminal conviction as well. Carter Page, he's been put through the grinder. Roger Stone has been put through the grinder. Jeremy Corsi is now also threatened with a prison sentence. I mean, it is abominable behavior, completely outrageous, entirely wrong.
And let's not forget that, to me, I think a lot of the hysteria to bring Assange back to the U.S. and to put him in prison for life, essentially, a lot of it is drummed up by the Mueller investigation, because I think Mueller fired up a lot of the Russiagate believers and these loonies to actually think that Assange is working with Russia. So he must be brought to the U.S., prosecuted, imprisoned for treason, and it just doesn't stop, even though he's not even an American citizen. So I think Assange is also suffering at the hands of this Russiagate investigation.
Absolutely. I mean, the way it has been used to destroy Assange's reputation as well, to picture him as some kind of agent of the Kremlin, which completely disregarding, by the way, the value of the DNC and Podesta emails and the extraordinary electoral manipulation that was going on within the Democratic Party, which meant that the primaries were essentially fixed in Hillary Clinton's favor. I mean, everybody seems to forget all of that. I mean, instead, the whole animus, the hatred of Assange is now unbelievable. And it's leading people into a very dangerous situation where Assange is going to be prosecuted and probably sent to prison simply for publishing information which is true, something that is totally contrary to the legal principles and the constitutional principles upon which the United States was founded.
Well, let's hope that this weekend at the G20, Trump and Putin do manage to come through with some constructive dialogue and some constructive policy on issues that do matter.
You know something, Alex, I've given up hoping about that. I think they will speak to each other. I think they will avoid having any press conferences because of the way the last press conference that they had in Helsinki was completely misrepresented. I mean, it wasn't the awful thing that people say it was. And I think they will exchange ideas. They will exchange information. I think that Trump knows the importance of keeping John Bolton present at all times now when he speaks with Putin. But I don't think that they will come up with anything positive, because the reality is that the hysteria of the US at the moment is so great that it's very difficult to. I think once he's got his new Attorney General, might be Brian Whitaker, might be someone else, fully in place, and once he's managed to gain control, that's to say Trump has managed to fully gain control of this investigation, and on top of it, then we might be seeing things moving in a different direction. But I think Buenos Aires is coming too soon for that.
All right. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you for a fascinating discussion on all the news around Muellergate. That's what we'll call it from now on, Muellergate. All right, guys, visit the Duran shop, buy a t-shirt. It really helps us out. They're demonetizing a lot of our videos. So every time you buy a shirt, it really, really helps us create programs like this for you. And in the description box, you'll find a link to our PayPal and Patreon page so you can donate to the Duran as well. Alexander Mercouris, editor-in-chief of the Duran. Thank you once again. Thank you, everybody. Until next time, take care.